near the lower canals. A woman by the name of Liddy remembered Samuel coming back to his cabin late one night, his clothes wet, his hands muddy. Around the same time Stokes vanished. They didn't level any accusation at him. They didn't spread loud gossip. But once the sun went down and the overseers had withdrawn, a quiet understanding began passing from mouth to mouth. Something had shifted. Someone was striking back. The third death shattered any pretense that this was merely bad luck. On November the 19th, 1834, Luther Pedigrew was overseeing a work gang in one of the remote fields at the plantation's northwest corner. Pedigrew was a name that people uttered with dread. He was infamous for punishments that reached beyond discipline into a cruelty that made even other overseers uncomfortable. To be assigned to his gang meant living under the constant expectation of pain. That afternoon, the sun was lowering behind the cypress trees, and long shadows stretched over the flooded fields. Pedigrew stood by one of the main irrigation canals shouting orders. A worker named Cyrus, roughly 30 yards off, heard the overseer's voice surge in anger, then twist into something else. Surprise, alarm, and then a sudden splash. Cyrus looked up. Pedigrew was no longer on the bank. He was in the canal, thrashing, arms striking the water, his head dipping under and surfacing again in desperate, gasping breaths. Cyrus dropped his tools and ran toward the canal, joined by 3 other men. By the time they reached the edge, Pedigrew had already vanished beneath the murky surface. They dove in, feeling blindly through the cold, muddy water. It took them nearly 20 minutes to drag his body out, wedged as it was against a submerged post. What they saw on the bank shocked even men who had witnessed too much. In Pegrew's throat bore dark oval bruises. Bruises shaped like fingers. Bruises that made it unmistakably clear this man had not slipped. He'd been seized. He'd been choked. Then he'd been drowned. The county constable, a man named Dwight, came to investigate. He questioned every enslaved worker who had been in that field. No one admitted to seeing any struggle. No one described a fight. They all offered the same account. They heard a shout. They heard a splash. They looked up. Pedigrew was already in the water. Under pressure, Cyrus finally added something else. Something that would reverberate far beyond Riverbend. Something came up out of the water, he said. Dwight pressed him to clarify. Cyrus tried and failed. He shook his head, his eyes distant, reliving that instant. 1 minute Mr. Pedigrew was shouting, he said the next. Something just rose up. By the time I looked, he was gone. Dwight wrote it down but wasn't sure what to make of it. Something came out of the water. It sounded more like superstition than evidence. With no suspect and no clear testimony, he recorded it as death by drowning at the hands of person or persons unknown. Pedigrew was buried beside Gaffin. Another overseer hired, another grave filled. But Cyrus's phrase lingered. Something came out of the water. If that was how the enslaved people had experienced these deaths, sudden, invisible, unstoppable. One moment, the powerful man was shouting untouchable. The next, he was gone. Dragged down by hands that no one seemed to see. 3 deaths in 4 months on the same plantation would have been alarming on their own. Claymore tried to convince himself it was terrible luck. Then stories from other properties began drifting in. In December 1834, a slave catcher named William Dorsch disappeared near Haywood Plantation 15 miles upriver. His horse was found loose. Dorsch was never located. In January 1835, a merchant named Ambrose Talley, who bought rice from planters and shipped it to Charleston, was discovered with his throat cut on a back road between 2 estates. His money was untouched. In February, 2 more overseers vanished from neighboring plantations, both while making evening rounds. No witnesses, no explanation. By March 1835, plantation owners all along the coastal lowlands were meeting behind closed doors, speaking in anxious, hushed voices. They didn't yet have language that felt safe enough to use in public. But they knew 3 things. The deaths were too frequent to be coincidence. They were too similar to be random. They were aimed at a particular kind of man. Those who upheld slavery with exceptional cruelty. Somewhere in those fields and canals, someone was hunting them. As someone who knew the land better than any overseer ever could. Someone who understood where water was an ally, where mud concealed, where darkness erased footprints. That's when the name began. Not in any official record, not in any newspaper, but in the slave quarters in whispered Gullah. In songs and stories that white ears were never meant to grasp, a figure took shape. The river ghost, a man who moved like water, a shadow who struck near rivers, creeks, canals, and swamps. A presence no white man could predict and no enslaved person would betray. Some claimed he could breathe underwater, others said he vanished into fog. Some swore he wasn't human at all. But the older ones, those who had lived with cruelty long enough to recognize what human rage and human patience could do, knew better. They'd seen men beaten and broken. They'd also seen a few who refused to break. To them, the river ghost wasn't a monster. He was a man who watched, a man who waited. A man who had finally decided that if the river could swallow the bodies of the enslaved, it could just as well swallow the bodies of the masters. And some of them, when they watched Samuel moving quietly through the fields, never punished, never loud, always watching, they began to wonder. Not out loud, not where anyone could hear, but in the silent space between one heartbeat and the next, is it him? By the spring of 1835, Thaddius Claymore was a man coming undone. He didn't display it publicly. Planters never admitted fear, but his nights had grown sleepless, his routines tense, his eyes constantly scanning the fields, as if the rice itself might rise up against him. 3 overseers from Riverbend were dead. Several more from neighboring plantations had vanished or washed up in shallow water. A merchant was found with his throat cut. A slave catcher had disappeared without a trace. And all of it, every death, every disappearance, had occurred near water. Claymore didn't believe in spirits. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in patterns. And the pattern pointed in one direction. A clear's throat. Someone was killing men who upheld slavery. Someone who knew the land intimately. Someone who moved invisibly. Someone who waited for the perfect moment before striking. He began replaying details in his mind, connecting threads that had previously gone unnoticed. Samuel's position in the outer fields. Samuel's calm, almost unsettling obedience. Samuel's ability to move without drawing attention. Samuel always being assigned near the areas where deaths occurred. Samuel's cabin always neat. Samuel's tools always sharp. Samuel's expression always unreadable. No one else saw it, but Claymore did, and the certainty grew in him like a sickness. If Samuel stayed at Riverbend, Claymore would die next. The decision to sell the ghost. On October the 15th, 1835, Claymore stood on the veranda of his plantation house, staring across his fields as dusk settled over the low country. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of mud and decay rising from the flooded paddies. He thought of Horace Gaffin face down in muddy canal water. Benjamin Stokes. Mission who vanished as if swallowed by the dark itself. Luther Pedigrew dragged into a canal by hands. No one saw. The whispers from other plantations. That word murmured across Gullah speaking quarters. River ghost. Claymore placed his hand on the pistol he now carried everywhere, a habit he'd developed after Petigrew's death, and murmured aloud to no one, Samuel will be the end of me. The next morning he acted. He ordered his estate manager to prepare Samuel for sale. He gave no reason. He insisted the sale be swift and quiet. Better to lose a strong worker than to risk his own life. On November 3, 1835, Samuel was taken to the Savannah auction house in chains, his second time on that block. Hutchkins, the auctioneer, the same man who had sold him 4 years earlier, once again praised his strong constitution, good teeth, and sound obedience. A cotton planter named Vincent Hardesty purchased Samuel for $750. Samuel showed no emotion, not surprise, not fear, not anger. He simply lowered his head, climbed into the wagon with 4 other people bought that day, and let the horses pull him south toward Hardesty's estate in McIntosh County. And then silence. For 3 months after Samuel's departure, the killings at Riverbend ceased. No bodies, no vanishing overseers, no whispers about strange footprints near water. Claymore finally slept through the night. He told himself he had acted wisely. He had removed the threat, even if he couldn't prove who or what the threat really was. Riverbend returned to its terrible normal. Men died of fever instead of strangulation. Bodies were buried from disease rather than drowning. Claymore convinced himself the nightmare had ended. He was wrong. The ghost followed the sale. On February 17, 1836, and a slave catcher named Josiah Merrick was found dead in a creek near Hardesty's plantation, where Samuel now lived and worked. Merrick's body bore the same marks seen at Riverbend. Bruising on the throat, water in the lungs, drowning in water too shallow to drown a grown man. Local authorities noted the similarity but didn't connect the dots. The enslaved community did. They whispered names that white men refused to speak, and the river ghost began killing again. Not at Riverbend. Claymore had bought himself time. But now in McIntosh County, Samuel had simply relocated his war, sold again and again and again. Over the next 14 years, Samuel was sold 9 more times, drifting down the Georgia and South Carolina coast. And everywhere he went, the pattern followed. Months of silence, careful observation, mapping the land, watching routines, and then death. Not random death, not drunken accidents, not missteps in the dark. Executions. Executions disguised as misfortune. Executions that white authorities refused to believe could come from a man with no rights and no freedom. Executions that enslaved people understood as justice. Every owner eventually felt a growing unease. The same unease Claymore had felt, the same fear, the same realization that something was wrong with this quiet field hand. But none of them had proof. Samuel never disobeyed, never spoke out, never fought. He simply worked and waited and killed, then got sold again the moment suspicion grew too heavy. The river ghost didn't run from plantation to plantation. Plantation owners pushed him along, selling him to save themselves, never realizing they were sending death into someone else's fields. Meanwhile, a legend grew. In the slave quarters from Edisto to Darien, Savannah to Brunswick, people whispered stories. Stories of a tall man who moved like water. Stories of an Avenger who made overseers fear the canals the same way enslaved people feared the whip. Stories that white men claimed were superstition, but enslaved people knew a truth. Some said he could become part of the swamp, hold his breath longer than a man should, melt into fog, rise from water silently enough to kill before anyone heard a sound. But the older ones, the ones who knew how survival really worked, understood Samuel wasn't a ghost. He was a man with patience sharper than any blade. A man who turned the landscape itself into a weapon. A man who learned the river better than the overseers who died beside it. A man who refused to break. By 1845, the killings along the Georgia and South Carolina low country had become too frequent, too patterned, too precise to dismiss as misfortune. Local sheriffs whispered about them but avoided official reports. Planters prayed over them but refused to admit what they feared. Slave catchers spoke the name River Ghost with lowered voices. And still no white authority could say with certainty who or what was responsible. That silence ended when the federal government stepped in. A U.S. Marshal named Silas Crenshaw was assigned to investigate the pattern of deaths that had quietly plagued plantations for more than a decade. Crenshaw was unlike the local men who had fumbled through half-hearted inquiries. He was educated, methodical, and had no personal stake in protecting plantation reputations. He approached the matter with cold precision, like a man solving a puzzle rather than preserving a way of life. For 6 months, he buried himself in paperwork. He read plantation ledgers, auction records, coroner reports, private letters, and death certificates. He rode from Savannah to Beaufort, from Edisto to Darien, interviewing anyone who might recall the smallest detail. Slowly, he began charting deaths on a hand-drawn map. A pattern emerged, one that no plantation owner wanted to acknowledge. Mission: each cluster of deaths followed the movement of one enslaved man sold repeatedly over 14 years. The man was always listed under the same name, Samuel, always described as tall, always sold after a death, never before, always quiet, obedient, unremarkable on paper. But the deaths told a different story. Crenshaw documented at least 112 killings that matched Samuel's movements. Victims drowned in shallow water, men found with bruised throats but no witnesses, bodies discovered near canals, rivers, marshes, or swamps. Deaths that slaves whispered about and whites tried to explain away as accidents. The Marshal didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in patterns, and the pattern screamed of a single relentless hand. On July 10, 1845, Crenshaw submitted a formal request for a federal warrant. It listed Samuel as the prime suspect in a series of murders stretching from Savannah to Charleston. The request was granted immediately. 4 days later, Crenshaw led a detachment of armed men to the Turpentine camp, where Samuel had reportedly been last seen. Workers confirmed he had eaten breakfast with them that morning. They had watched him walk toward his cabin, but when Crenshaw pushed open the cabin door, the pallet was empty.